Well, this time last week, many of us were down at Crown Casino joining the Refugee Action Collective protest against Pauline Hanson. She was screening her obnoxious movie at Village Cinemas. There were more than 200 of us there at quite short notice, including a serious contingent of unionists, excellent range of speakers, and most heartening of all, a group of Village Cinema workers who actually ceased work, walked off the job over health and safety concerns, and came over and joined the rally. It was a really brilliant moment of anti-racism unity and a real boost for anti-racists everywhere. Hopefully, it was also a reminder to Pauline Hanson of a time in the late 1990s where she couldn't go anywhere in Australia without being faced with large demonstrations opposed to her and her racist agenda. And that kind of tradition of mobilising against One Nation, against Pauline Hanson, against racism, is one that we need to rebuild and rebuild quite rapidly. All the opinion polls pretty much show One Nation above 20% in the polls. One of them in the last few days, I think on Saturday, showed One Nation at 26%. Anthony Green, who used to be the election expert for the ABC, has already drawn up a list of 25 seats that One Nation will win if they manage to maintain a 25% vote at the next election, which, to be honest, is a couple of years away. And I think we need to be very clear that Pauline Hanson is capitalising on the boiling anger over the cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, the general sense of decay and despair in society, the distrust of authority, the distrust of the existing parties which have traditionally dominated politics. She's capitalising on that, but her aim is to drive through a deeply racist agenda. And One Nation is committed to the deportation of 75,000 people and to a ban on immigration from everyone from so-called Muslim countries. How they would run that is a problem we will hopefully never find out. And they are capitalising not just on those conditions I mentioned, but also on the Islamophobic response to Bondi, an Islamophobic response fuelled by Anthony Albanese, by Susan Ley, but also by Pauline Hanson, blaming the Palestine rallies for the massacre at Bondi, and in the case of One Nation, explicitly blaming Muslims. And there has been a rise of Islamophobic attacks on the streets. So in these circumstances, we need to be inspired by last week, but we need to learn from the much, much bigger mobilisations and campaign against One Nation 30 years ago. Now, for younger comrades here, it's difficult to explain and difficult to overestimate the bombshell that Hanson represented on the political landscape. She was elected for the seat of Oxley, a very solid Labour seat, which is based on Ipswich, just west of Brisbane. She was elected in Oxley in the federal election in March of 1996. And she very quickly moved onto the front foot. Even before she made her infamous maiden speech, she told a conference that she was calling for an end to all immigration and the defence of Australia's, quotes, Anglo-Celtic European heritage, Judeo-Christian beliefs, English law and the Westminster parliamentary system. And she told a magazine at the time, maybe I do come on like a Sherman tank, but how else am I going to say that I want a halt on Asians coming into the country? You tell me, how would you say it? And then she followed this up with her maiden parliamentary speech in which she said that Australia was being swamped by Asians. And she got an enormous multiplier effect from the mass media, who portrayed her as, a small business person, a fish and chip shop owner, a battler, a housewife, just an ordinary person saying what everybody was really thinking. And so her ideas went largely unchallenged, certainly in the first few months. How did she get elected? She did not get elected because she was a racist. She got elected because she was a Liberal. She was actually the Liberal candidate for Oxley. The Liberals dumped her after she made grotesquely racist remarks about Aboriginal people, but by then it was too late to take her off the ballot paper. So when most people in Oxley went to vote, they saw her as the Liberal candidate. There were actually Liberal Party members out campaigning for her election. And the reality is she got elected on the back of a huge swing to the Liberal Party and the National Party right across Australia. By 1996, people had had a gutful of the Hawke and Keating Labor governments, of very high unemployment, double the level of unemployment that we have today, limitations, cuts to working class living standards, privatisation and the rest of it. And in 1996, as the expression went, people were sitting on the verandas with baseball bats ready to take Labor out. And so Hanson was a beneficiary of that general swing. She wasn't elected as a racist, but the moment she was elected, she went on the front foot in order to promote racism. And that led to a whole range of attacks on the streets against Asian people. Spitting, assaulting, bashing, all sorts of horrific attacks. Who was she and who is she? She was, as I say, portrayed as a battler, a small person up against the machine. The reality is she was not only a Liberal, she was quite wealthy. In 1996, she had a 45-hectare property. She had a house that was worth something like 6 times more than the average working class house at the time. In her fish and chip shop, she didn't do much work. She had 8 casual workers and she ran a consultancy. And I think it's also important to say that she was always a racist. She is actually genuine in her racism. She doesn't adopt it as an electoral ploy like many politicians do. She is deeply racist. Her ex-husband said she was always happy to take money from Aboriginal people, but behind their backs, excuse my language, she called them black bastards. And today that continuation of establishment, raving against the establishment, but in practice hand in glove with big business is continued, and one of her best mates is Gina Rinehart. Gina Rinehart has actually put pressure on some very big Liberal Party donors to switch their donations to One Nation. She gives Pauline her private jet to whiz around the country. She has taken Pauline to Mar-a-Lago to smooch up to Donald Trump. Now, what was the response to her election in 1996? Actually, it was healthy and it was rapid. There's a couple more chairs down here if people want them. It was healthy and it was rapid. Within a matter of weeks, there was a rally in Brisbane of 4,000 people. And then rallies began to pop up everywhere. The biggest one was here in Melbourne. It was 30,000 people. And all of this simply accelerated when Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, which is how it was known when it was launched, came into being in 1997. And very, very quickly it established itself as being a serious operator. 350 branches, 18,000 members, and in 1988 it contested the Queensland state election and won 11 seats, 11 One Nation MPs in the state parliament. And alongside this, as I say, a rise in racist attacks on the streets. And the rallies stepped up as a result. She could go nowhere without mass opposition. She never spoke in the Melbourne CBD. That she tried to speak at Melbourne University. That got shut down by hundreds of people invading the campus. And the National Tertiary Education Union carried a motion condemning the university for even considering renting a room out to Pauline Hanson. There were rallies everywhere. In Melbourne, there were some quite militant rallies. In Dandenong, at Hawthorn, there was one down the freeway at Geelong, but they were everywhere, small towns and large towns. In Perth, 2,000 people rocked up, and she said it was the worst 24 hours of her life. Now, I'm not going to go through the ins and outs of each rally. There are people here in the room who can share their war stories. The important thing was that there were rallies, and the attempt was made clearly to pin the racist label on Pauline Hanson, to make her supporters feel uncomfortable, and to try and put an obstacle in the way of what appeared to be a juggernaut. What I want to do in the second part of the meeting is very much draw out some lessons from this. The first one is that we cannot have any faith or any expectation in the leaders of the major parties. There is a myth which is still recycled today in the media that John Howard was staunch and held the ground against One Nation, and that was what contributed to One Nation eventually peaking and going into decline. And it's really important we call that out as a myth, as bullshit, because if people think John Howard is responsible for defeating One Nation, then they may actually look at Susan Ley and hope that somehow she can pull off something similar. John Howard already had a track record of racist remarks, particularly against Asians, even before he became Prime Minister. The moment he was elected, he cut immigration by 20%. He cut benefit payments to Aboriginal students, and he went on the front foot against Indigenous people generally. He attacked what was called the black armband view of history. So in other words, if you were complaining or campaigning about the dispossession of the First Nations people, or about genocide, or about stolen generations, or about deaths in custody, you could shut up. That wasn't a topic that he wanted any of us to be talking about. And importantly, he stood up and over again for free speech. And in the context of the rise of Hanson and One Nation, that was a coded message to One Nation voters that as the Liberal Prime Minister, I've got your back. It's okay to say racist things. I'm giving you permission. That means you can come back to the fold, to the Liberal Party fold. I think the other side of this is that we cannot possibly look to the leadership of the Labour Party. Today, Anthony Albanese is running dead on One Nation. I'll come back to that in my closing remarks. In '96, Kim Beazley was the leader of the Labour Party, leader of the opposition. And some people have suggested to me it's easier to build a campaign now against One Nation because we've got a Labour government, or maybe it's harder. People have different views on the issue. Actually, it didn't make much difference having a Liberal government because the Labour Party leadership was rotten. Beazley refused to come out and vigorously put the racist tag on Hanson. He even didn't put the racist tag on Howard. In 1996, at the New South Wales State Labour Conference, John Della Bosca, who was the State Secretary, called out Howard as a racist because he wouldn't fight Hanson and One Nation. And Beazley's response was to say to Della Bosca, he can use his own words. I don't go down the road of characterising John Howard like that. So rather than taking on racism, there was an accommodation to racism. Insofar as Beazley was prepared to stand up against racism, it was in the interests of Australian capitalism, not in the interests of ordinary working class people of Asian background who were at risk walking down the street. And his concern was that the rise of One Nation would trigger a memory, a relatively recent memory amongst importers, business partners, and so on in Southeast and East Asia of Australia as being the land of white Australia. Remembering that white Australia had only been formally abolished little more than 20 years before this period we're talking about. So for many people in Asia, Australia was still white Australia. And Beazley's concern was that Hanson would actually damage Australian exports to the region. It is absolutely critical, he told Parliament, that this motion condemning racist violence, bipartisan and completely meaningless, when it is passed, goes out as a signal to the region that Australia is still in business as a decent society. So Australian capitalism first, anti-racism well down the track. Now, turning to the people who did respond to One Nation, I want to draw out some some lessons here. Firstly, the rallies were always mass rallies, whether they were hundreds or thousands. They were never small-scale stunts, small numbers of people, trying to, gum up the works. They were always based on mass mobilisations. They were always based on the idea that One Nation supporters were not fascists. They were being taken down a racist path, and many of them were racist to start off with, but they were people who were deeply angry about the crisis in society and deeply angry with Labour. And the aim of mobilising at the One Nation forums was not to beat up One Nation supporters and whatever. Actually, primarily it was to demoralise them and make them think twice about coming back to a future event. So people going in were certainly given a torrid time, but it was a torrid time in order to demoralise them, not in order to take them on as fascists. It was also important, and this was an argument that our predecessor as an organisation, Solidarity's predecessor, had to fight quite vigorously, that we didn't treat One Nation supporters as idiots. There was a famous incident where Hanson appeared on one of the TV shows, probably on the ABC, and was asked what she thought about xenophobia. And she said, "Please explain." Now, xenophobia is a fancy Greek word for racism. Actually, my bet is if you went out onto the street and asked people, a majority of people walking down the street would not know that word. And yet many smug people on the left laughed at Hanson because she didn't know that word. And that was really, really dangerous, because Hanson supporters, when people laughed at Hanson, thought they were laughing at her. It was an echo of an argument to come later where Hillary Clinton talked about Trump supporters as deplorables. Now, many of them are rotten and racist, and that's true of Hanson supporters as well. But the reason she's gone from less than 6% maybe to 26% in the polls is not because 20% more people have decided they want to be really hardline racist. It's because Labour is failing them. They have no trust in the Liberals. They have no trust in the system. And they turn to Hanson because she's always stood her ground. The danger, if we don't put an obstacle in the way of that, is that she will take people angry with Labour and turn them into people who are angry with migrants, with Muslims, with foreigners, and so on and so forth. And we always argued that as well as dealing with One Nation public forums and the like, that it was important that socialists encourage working class fight back. Because if there was a working class fight back around cost of living, wages, jobs and services, then that would act as a way of pulling One Nation's, at least a section of One Nation's base, over to the left. I think the other thing that really stands out is the importance of taking a united front approach to fighting against the racists. And by that I mean revolutionaries going to reformists and say, we have our disagreements and we can argue about them, but we need to unite against a common enemy in action, which incidentally also gives the revolutionaries a much bigger chance of making arguments to a wider audience. And so that was reflected in the fact that the Brisbane rally, for instance, which I mentioned, was organised by 6 unions, supported by ALP branches and addressed by a Labour MP. The really big rally in Melbourne, the one of 30,000 people, wasn't organised by socialists, it was organised by Trades Hall. And then I want to give you a more concrete example of where this politics flows through. There was a by-election in Northcote in 1998. And back in 1998, Northcote was rock-solid Labour seat. The Greens in those days were still very small and very marginal. Rock-solid Labour seat, and One Nation stood a candidate. No Liberal candidate stood. So this was a real opportunity for One Nation to make a breakthrough. And we argued that whatever our differences, we had to unite to block this advance by One Nation. And the campaign coalesced around the slogan, "Put One Nation last." And we called on everybody, and we were a player on the left. We called on the rest of the left, Greens, Independents, Labour Party people, to unite around that slogan. And we even took money from Chinese Australian business people to pay for the printing. And the result was we leafleted every single house in Northcote, and on election day there were people on every polling booth handing out how not to vote cards against One Nation. Now that was successful. One Nation only got 6%. But I think within that example, there's the fact that 2 rallies were called against One Nation in Northcote. The first was called by a group which had a sectarian approach towards the Labour Party, that was against One Nation but bitterly hostile to the Labour Party as well. That was a relatively small rally. We helped call a rally which was a united anti-racist response. Labour, Greens, Socialists, Independents, all together on the streets, and that rally was decisively bigger. And I think that's also a lesson for today. All right, I need to wind up. Looking at today, world has changed to some extent. The fact that Pauline Hanson could come into the CBD last week, I think, is an indication that we still have to re-win the argument about the dangers of One Nation with a range of people. It's also the case that many of the racist ideas which seemed outlandish in 1996 are now mainstream. So Pauline Hanson, for instance, argued that boats carrying asylum seekers attempting to reach Australia should be turned back in mid-ocean. And everybody went, oh my God, what a disgusting racist idea. It is now bipartisan policy for Labour and Coalition that boats will be turned back at sea. And as I've mentioned, Labour and Liberal have spent the last year engaged in a debate on who can be toughest on migration. Labour has introduced some of the harshest deportation laws this country has seen in modern times. And although it's nothing like on the scale of Minneapolis and ICE, there are people being seized off the streets of Australia and sent to Nauru in the South Pacific. It's still at a micro level, not a macro level, but the reality is those sorts of policies in place. And this opens up a huge space for Hanson to say, I am the real person who's tough on boat people. I am the real person who's tough on migration. I'm the one who's prepared to say what it will take to stop terrorism in this country, and that means stopping Muslim migration. And that will give her a certain credibility around which people coalesce. The last thing to say is this. Labour will not stand up to Hanson. I'm absolutely confident that Labour will not stand up to Hanson in a principled way. Not only is Labour laying the basis for Hanson with its attacks on migrants and refugees, with its horrific response to Bondi, which is basically criminalising the Palestine movement for something which it bore no responsibility for. Albanese is a very crude number cruncher, and he will sit back and go, great, the right wing is tearing itself to pieces, One Nation, Nationals, Liberals, they'll tear themselves to pieces and we will come through and win the next election. Of the 25 seats that Anthony Green says One Nation is most likely to win, only 5 are Labour, 20 are Liberal or National. And that is a huge danger. We have to campaign against Anthony Albanese's inaction, because his inaction may lead to a Labour victory in the next election, but it will also lead to an increase in racism. Very last thing, I will say. Very last thing. Sorry, Tom. The role of organised revolutionary socialists back in the late 90s was absolutely crucial. We had to argue for mass rallies. We had to argue for a particular approach for those mass rallies. We had to argue against the bullshit that said that we were depriving racists and Hanson of free speech. We had to reach out and form united front opposition. We had to argue that it was important that Socialists, Labour and Greens work together against the common enemy. And that need for revolutionary socialists today is just as urgent. We need more solidarity members in unions, in workplaces, on campuses and in communities. The other thing I'll say is this. We need to actually not just bemoan the rise of One Nation. We also need to organise against the rise of One Nation. And The Refugee Action Collective has organised this forum. It's in just under 3 weeks' time. It's got a really wide array of speakers from across the movement, a very diverse platform. We want Trades Hall to be full, to standing room. We want to see this meeting as being a launch pad for serious ongoing anti-racist organising in some shape or form. You've got a leaflet on your chair. There's piles more on the table. Go out and build this meeting.